Hello, Degrassi fans, and welcome to the Degrassi Kid podcast, where each week we break down the history and impact of our favorite teen TV show. I'm Jocelyn, and this week I have a question for you. Why is there no Indigenous representation on Degrassi? Degrassi is a show that's known for representing all kinds of people with all kinds of backgrounds. Degrassi has tackled stories about Syrian refugee students fleeing a war and coming to Canada, about Muslim students being targeted after the events of 9/11, and they've given us insight into different multicultural households like Manny's Filipino family or Ali and Sav's Indian parents. Degrassi may not always tell these stories in the best way. Particularly, there's a lot of fair criticism about the show's inability to develop black characters. Black characters on the show, like Hazel and Shantae, are often sidekicks to their white best friends and help them through their problems instead of getting storylines of their own. And racism against black students only seems to exist on Degrassi when it's happening outside of the school, like when BLT is called the N-word at Borden High, when Liberty is stereotyped at Smithdale College, or when Connor and Dallas are racially profiled at the mall. Even when it does happen at Degrassi through Frankie's racism storyline in Degrassi Next Class, they have to bring in a whole new set of black students from another school to tell their story effectively. Degrassi has typically failed at telling compelling stories about characters of color, especially in comparison to their white characters, who they take the time and care to develop well. Leading white characters like Caitlin Ryan, Emma Nelson, Claire Edwards, and Maya Matlin are so rich with storytelling, family history, and a network of friends and connections to other people, something that just doesn't happen for black characters or characters of color on the show. But when it comes to Indigenous characters, Degrassi doesn't tell their story at all. There is not one character on Degrassi who identifies as Indigenous. We can make some assumptions because there are Indigenous actors on the show, but at no point does anyone say or allude to the fact that they're Indigenous, which feels like a pretty large gap that's missing in a Canadian TV show centered around the equality, inclusion, and diversity of everyone. But why? Why was it that Degrassi avoided telling stories about Indigenous people? What did the Indigenous actors who appeared on the show have to say about it? And how does it impact real Indigenous Degrassi fans to not see yourself on TV? Today, we're breaking down the history and impact of Indigenous representation on Degrassi, or the lack thereof, and it's only going to happen here on a brand new episode of the Degrassi Kid podcast.
All the kids should be there for you, whatever it is. You know she'll pull through, whatever it takes, or whatever it takes. Kids got you.
Why are there no Indigenous people on Degrassi? Degrassi has always praised itself for being a show that tells real stories about real kids in high school, but they've never told a story about what it's like to be Indigenous. In my personal experience, the way I connect with the show was through their representation of queer characters. I grew up closeted in high school, and seeing a character like Fiona Coyne come out on television made a huge impact in the way that I felt about myself. Seeing someone be so proudly themselves in front of everyone can make it easier for you to be yourself at home, at school, or out in your community. And that's something that Degrassi knows. In fact, it's the thing that Degrassi prides itself in. They often go the extra mile to get their stories just right. For example, in Spike's pregnancy storyline in Degrassi Junior High, they talked to real teenagers about their experiences being pregnant. For Cam's suicide storyline, they spoke to mental health professionals and counselors about the warning signs of suicide and why a teenager might do something like this. When it came to casting, Degrassi always had the idea that anyone can be on TV. You don't have to look a certain way or be signed to a certain agency. You just had to be a kid. From its inception, Degrassi has taken on the responsibility of taking your story, your face, your voice, your experiences, and putting it on TV. But they didn't do that for Indigenous kids. And to clarify, there are several groups that Degrassi hasn't done well at developing or representing on the show. They could have done better at developing black characters, Jewish characters, disabled characters, asexual characters, and so on. But for me personally, when I'm asked what stories I'd like to see on something like a Degrassi reboot, it's this. I want to see an Indigenous student. Degrassi is one of my favorite shows because it put me on TV. It told my story through Fiona. But it also taught me about what other people go through. Things that I haven't experienced. It made me sympathetic to how good people can end up addicted to drugs, like Craig Manning was. End up needing an abortion, like Manny Santos, or what it's like to lose your parents at a young age, like Wheels. It made me compassionate and open to meeting and understanding new people. By telling stories about so many different kinds of people and different kinds of experiences, Degrassi taught me a lot about being kinder, compassionate, and a more accepting person of those around me. And in Canada, we have a huge problem with expressing that same kindness, compassion, and acceptance towards Indigenous people. The history of Canada is essentially a history of genocide against the Indigenous. There's this horrible racist belief that many Canadians currently hold about Indigenous people being lazy, getting free handouts from the government, and being almost inhuman. So inhuman that they don't matter. And in media, Canada doesn't do any better. Only now are we finally starting to see an increase in Indigenous actors, Indigenous TV shows, and Indigenous storytelling altogether. Shows like Reservation Dogs, Dark Winds, and Unsettled are all great examples of Indigenous people making Indigenous television and putting their stories on TV themselves. But still, it's only just the beginning, especially when you look at how Indigenous people have been treated in Canada. Before we get into the history of Indigenous people, let's take a moment to look into the Indigenous actors who have appeared on Degrassi. In total, there are 5 actors on Degrassi who identify as Indigenous, or at least part Indigenous. Those actors play Grace, Grace's mom, the guidance counselor, Miss Suave, Cam Saunders, and the teacher from Degrassi Junior High, Miss Avery. Collectively, none of their characters openly identify as Indigenous. At most, Grace's last name, Cardinal, does have Indigenous roots to it. Nakusek Gold, who played Grace on Degrassi The Next Generation and Degrassi Next Class, said that originally Degrassi did colorblind casting for Grace. This means that they didn't have a race or ethnicity picked out for the character ahead of time. They were just looking for an actor, and whoever was the best fit would get the role. And that happened to be Nakusek. After she was hired, then later they gave Grace a Cree last name. Nakusek said Cardinal is Indigenous to a tribe in Alberta. I am Mi'kmaq, which is from the East Coast. So they did change my heritage slightly. Indigenous can be used to describe many different cultures, she said. And in Canada, there are 3 groups of Indigenous people: First Nation Indigenous, Inuit Indigenous, and Métis Indigenous, who all have their own cultures, languages, and communities within them. So with that, the most amount of Indigenous representation we have on Degrassi is that Grace Cardinal has an Indigenous last name and is played by an Indigenous actor, but never identifies herself as Indigenous. And that's still huge, but I feel like this is similar to characters like Yael in Degrassi Next Class. Yael has a Jewish name, and the actress who plays Yael is Jewish, but there's nothing that actually makes Yael a Jewish character. And I want to clarify, I mean this purely about fictional TV characters. In real life, nobody owes you shit. There's no metrics to being Indigenous enough or being Jewish enough. You don't have to clarify to people that you're Indigenous for you to be Indigenous. And as a white person, I don't get to decide what is or isn't good enough representation for Indigenous people. Just because Grace doesn't say that she's Indigenous doesn't mean that she's not Indigenous. And Nakusek being an Indigenous actor is still huge representation on TV. I don't want to discredit that at all. And later, we'll even hear more from Degrassi fans who were excited to see someone like Grace on TV. But on TV, clarifying those identifiers and using that language to say I am Indigenous or I am Jewish can be huge for representation in the media. And that's what we're talking about today. And honestly, the reason that I know a lot of this information about Indigenous history is because Nakusek has always been a passionate activist for Indigenous issues and sharing these stories online on her social media. She frequently shares stories about Indigenous land rights, missing and murdered Indigenous girls and women, and holding the police accountable to their abuse of power over Indigenous people, which she said on Twitter. These opinions that she's posted have garnered her a reputation online for being controversial, for literally just telling true stories about experiences she's had or the experiences of Indigenous people around her. Nakusek said, "It's so weird to me that I've gained a reputation for being controversial. I don't see what's controversial about Indigenous issues." And I agree. But there was a claim I saw online where someone said that they watched a live stream where she said that she was being left out of certain Degrassi promos because of her online controversial presence, aka posting things about Indigenous issues. But I didn't see that statement come from her directly, and I wasn't in that live stream, so I can't say that that's necessarily true or draw any conclusions from it. But I can say it is true that compared to her other co-stars, Nakusette isn't in a lot of the promotions from Degrassi Next Class, especially when it comes to the social media posts behind the scenes. And it's true that she was often posting her opinions about Indigenous issues online and seen as an activist. So both of those things are both real, true facts that I can report on and share with you. And remember earlier when I said it's not my place to decide what representation isn't good enough for Indigenous kids on TV? Well, that's because in my research, I found a story about Nakusette visiting an Indigenous school and making a positive impact on the kids who attended. In 2015, she visited the Malpatue Kinamantanum School, a name that means the place where we learn, and a school with mainly Indigenous students. And of course, this is where I have to insert my classic, I'm a white person and I'm trying my best. My pronunciation might not be the best, but I am trying, and I have looked it up. Nakusette visited this school and answered questions from the class and stressed the importance of hard work, trying new roles, and always being true to yourself, she said. The students who Nakusette spoke to were very excited to talk to Grace from Degrassi, and each left with their own autograph and headshot of her character. One of the students said that she wants to grow up to be an actor just like her someday. Aww. Another Indigenous actress who appeared on the show is Cherie Maracle, who played Grace's mom on Degrassi. Cherie is an actor, singer, and songwriter of the Six Nations of the Grand River Tribe in Ontario, but more specifically the Mohawk Nation. Nakusette tweeted that her and Cherie have actually known each other since Nakusette was little, which I thought was so cute. Cherie also has appeared in Indigenous shows like The Unsettled, Tribal, and Blackstone. And again, her character isn't expressly Indigenous, but this is still huge representation for the Indigenous community. Dylan Everett, who played Cam Saunders on Degrassi, is also mixed race, white, and Indigenous. And Jennifer Podemski, who played Miss Soave on Degrassi, is mixed First Nations and Israeli. Jennifer has been very outspoken about her opinions on Indigenous representation in the media, and how she has even lost out on Indigenous roles to non-Indigenous actors. She said, "Everywhere I went, I just saw non-Indigenous people making content about us, as if they were us." Since then, Jennifer has become a director and a producer, with an emphasis on making Indigenous content. She said she was unsatisfied with seeing so many programs being created by white people telling stories about Native people and getting it wrong, and continuing to perpetrate negative stereotypes. When asked about shows like Degrassi, Jennifer said, "As much as I'm grateful for all of the non-Indigenous people that made the content that I was in and the content that got me to where I am, I couldn't help get this nagging feeling that something had to change," she said. And now, by becoming a director and producer and being in charge of these productions, Jennifer said that she's dedicated to creating a positive change in the industry for Indigenous creators. Most recently, Jennifer created a TV show called Unsettled, which featured Cherie Maracle. Out of the 55 people on the show, 50 of them are Indigenous. And even behind the scenes, the writers, producers, they're all Indigenous as well. Jennifer said, "It's impossible for someone who does not have a specific lens to express authentic, three-dimensional or multi-dimensional characters," she said. "And when Indigenous people tell Indigenous stories, it can become a community effort. If I'm telling a story, I'm not just going to tell it myself. I always have people helping me," Jennifer said. And that's something that rings true for Degrassi. One of the good things about Degrassi not having an Indigenous character is that they don't fall victim to being another show where white people told Indigenous stories and got them wrong. I think overall, for this to work, Degrassi would have to work with Indigenous creators, which is why I'd like to see it happen on the reboot, more so than wishing that I saw it in the past. I think Degrassi wasn't well equipped enough with diversity in their writer's room or their production team to tell these Indigenous stories well. Today, I think Degrassi's writing team would look a lot different. But in saying that, Jennifer said that the role of being an Indigenous storyteller weighs heavily on her. "We are rebuilding a broken, shattered, fractured narrative," she said. "All of the storytellers that are working out there today, and each mending and fixing and rebuilding a broken piece of it." Jennifer also appeared in a show called Reservation Dogs about Indigenous stories, and a Degrassi fan online named Prince Demetrius said, "Reservation Dogs is one of my favorite shows. As a mixed Native woman who didn't grow up near the rest of my tribe in Oklahoma, where the show is filmed, that show makes me so happy because so many of the characters remind me of my family members, and it has so many inside jokes and cultural components that are so specific to many of our cultures." Through all of this, we can just see how important it is to have Indigenous storytelling and how important it is to have diverse storytellers in all areas of production. Costume, hair, set design, writing, acting, all of these facets of production should have diversity to capture more authentic storytelling. The final Indigenous actor on Degrassi is Michelle Goodeve, who played Miss Avery in Degrassi Junior High and Degrassi High. Michelle is Indigenous, but specifically Métis. It's interesting because I was trying to think about the times that Indigenous people are even mentioned on Degrassi, and I could only think of one. It's this quick moment in Miss Avery's class. Let's listen in.
Oh, girls, how are your photos coming along? Fine. Oh, great. I'm really looking forward to seeing them. Oh, and Caitlin, that essay you wrote on Native peoples was just excellent. Congratulations.
Honestly, this is the only time that I can think of them mentioning Indigenous people on Degrassi, though I am totally open to hearing if you know of any others. This one is really small, and it only really stands out to me because the language has changed. I'm saying Indigenous, and she's saying Native, so what's the difference? Let's clarify the language used today around Indigenous people. Originally, white people chose the name Indian or Native to reference Indigenous people, but Indigenous people didn't feel like this was the right term. So white people changed it to Aboriginal, but Indigenous folks again didn't like this term because Aboriginal means not original, which makes even less sense than the first word. And again, this was a name that was placed onto them. They didn't get to choose it themselves. So Indigenous leaders across Canada came together and chose their own word. They chose Indigenous. The term Indigenous highlights people's connection to traditional territories and their experiences of colonization. It was a word that focused on uniting diverse communities, instead of a term that's basically for white people to say, oh, okay, so you're in this other category, and this is how we'll recognize you compared to everyone else. Though the way that you identify and the language that you use to identify yourself with is personal to each and every person. Some people may have a connection to the word Aboriginal because it's what they grew up with, or with other language that's important to them for other reasons. And that's okay too. Being true to who you are is all that matters. But overall, why does this matter? Why am I so passionate about Degrassi not including an Indigenous character on their show? Well, that's because I'm from Canada, and Canada is racist. One of the things that I talked about in my racism episode with Frankie's storyline is how, as a white person, I had to learn to check the things that I was taught, specifically about other races of people. For example, in school, we learn about slavery and how it was abolished, but we don't learn about the prison industrial complex and how it's just slavery behind a legal loophole, and that racism is still very rampant today. White people love to look at the past and say, but look at how much better we are now. The same exact thing goes for Indigenous history. In Canada, I grew up learning about Aboriginal people, like we said before. We didn't use the term Indigenous. But whether it's the way that I was explicitly taught about Indigenous history or something that I just pieced together myself in my little brain, but my understanding was that Indigenous people were a thing of the past, that they literally didn't exist anymore. I didn't personally know any Indigenous people until I got older and started meeting new kinds of people. History tends to be whitewashed. So, of course, I learned that the white people came to Canada and helped the Indigenous people. We learned about the tools they used, the homes they lived in, and the food they ate. It was all so primitive. Like, they lived outside and they used handmade tools and lived off the land. Thank God we came in and saved them. We made their life better with guns and concrete and Christianity. In my understanding, white people came in, took all of the Indigenous people and taught them how to be white or how to be better, and there wasn't any more Indigenous people left. Instead, they were just descendants of Indigenous people. Then the people around me would talk about Indigenous people and the racist beliefs that they held. So I learned that if someone claimed they were Indigenous or related to these Indigenous ancestors of the past, then they could get tax breaks and live on a reserve for free, where the government took care of them for life. thousands and thousands of dollars just handed to them so they could go buy flat screen TVs and blow it all in a night out in the casino. That is a very real and racist belief that I was taught by my school or socially by the people around me. I was personally lucky that I grew up in a mixed race household, so I learned about racism against Black people at a very young age. But that doesn't change the fact that I am white, and all of my experiences that I have are as a white person. And education on Black history doesn't mean that you're automatically immune to being racist to everyone. As I grew up, I started to learn about the ways that Canadians have been racist to Indigenous people, specifically through residential schools, violence against girls and women, and environmental terrorism. I'm going to go over them so you can understand why I'm so passionate about this lack of representation on TV. But again, remember, I'm a white person regurgitating this information that I've only learned over the last few years. None of this is really based on my own personal experiences outside of what I've been educated on. Because of that, I've linked resources from real Indigenous educators in the description below, and we'll be hearing from real Indigenous Degrassi fans in the next episode. But in short, Canada has a history and a very active present reality of being racist towards Indigenous people. I'll insert a trigger warning here for violence, sexual assault, and racism that will be talked about through the rest of the episode. Remember when I told you that white people came in and saved the Indigenous? Well, of course, that isn't true. Instead, the Canadian government created something called Canadian Indian Residential Schools. These schools were designed to teach Indigenous kids how to be white. They took them away from their families, cut off their hair, took away their belongings, forbid them from speaking to their family, and they were only taught English and Christian beliefs at school. Nothing about their own family history or their own native language. Today in Canada, we have something that acknowledges this past that we have. It's called Orange Shirt Day, which you may have heard of. It comes from a story by Phyllis Jack Webstad, who was a residential school survivor. She told the story that when she was 6 years old, she was taken away from her family and placed in one of these residential schools. Her family believed that it was a good thing and going to be a good experience for her with new opportunities, and her grandmother gifted her an orange shirt for her very first day. Except when she got there, all of her belongings, including her new orange shirt, were taken away from her. And what she experienced was not new opportunities, but abuse and neglect. To give you an understanding of how recent the history of residential schools are, Phyllis is 57 years old. This happened to her in 1973. The very last residential school in Canada closed down in 1997, when I was 3 years old. To give you a point of view, the kids of Degrassi Street, Degrassi Junior High, Degrassi High, and the Degrassi Schools Out movie had already aired and gone into multiple years of reruns by the time the last residential school ended. Degrassi: The Next Generation was only 4 years away from premiering on TV. And not to say that Degrassi is in any way responsible for residential schools, I do not want to imply that, but I know that this is a common point in time that we can all understand and get behind as a community. Also, we were all being lied to. The government pushed out propaganda that these schools were a good thing, and mixed with no education on Indigenous history and these racist beliefs against Indigenous people, all of this was swept under the rug and just accepted by society. Recently, I started learning more about residential schools because of the death count that has been growing. In the last few years, we've started excavating the sites of residential schools and finding children. Residential schools are the only schools in Canada that have unmarked graves with thousands and thousands of children's bodies inside of them, and all of those bodies are Indigenous. Policies were also created by the Canadian government to keep these kids away from their families. The schools were intentionally built away from Indigenous reserves, and there was a law that you could not leave your reserve unless you had a passport that was approved by the government. If you went outside of your reservation without a passport, then you could go to prison. When British people were coming over to Canada, they were having these wars with Indigenous people over the land that they rightfully owned. So together they came up with these treaties that would make life easier for the two to coexist. Except the government just used this as a means to control Indigenous people. For example, this passport system was created because, and I quote, Indians had to be kept separate from the rest of society for their own good, as contact tended to be injurious to them. So basically what the government was saying is you have to stay put in this one space because otherwise, us white people will kill you. So you should actually thank us for thinking of you and protecting you. But staying put didn't help. The government had made an agreement with Indigenous people that if they agreed to a peace settlement, one of the conditions is that they would help them with their agricultural development on these reserves so they could be more prosperous and support their families and their communities. The government agreed that they'd give each reserve farming equipment like hoes, spades, and hand plows, and this would help them develop their agricultural farming. They offered the most basic hand tools and offered no mechanical equipment because Canadians believed that Indigenous people were so primitive and uneducated that they probably couldn't even understand their advanced farming equipment. Except the white people who lived close to these reserves and were seeing this happening, they became upset because they felt that Indigenous people were getting a government handout, and that wasn't fair. So they changed the law saying that Indigenous people could only use these hand tools. If you had any type of machinery, like a horse-drawn plow, the police could come and take it away from you, even if you owned it before all of this or bought it with your own money. And that sounds like it's all stuff that happened in the past, right? That's kind of stuff that doesn't happen today. But it does. It just looks different. For example, today we have some tax laws that say some Indigenous people with status cards don't have to pay GST, which is a 5% sales tax on goods and services. So white people have reacted to that and said that's unfair. They're getting government handouts, which is literally the same thing that happened with the farming equipment. Today in 2024, when it comes to violence, today, Indigenous women are 4 times more likely to be the victims of violence and homicide, and even less likely to have police reports that are followed up about it. In my hometown last year, an Indigenous girl who was my age was missing for a month and a half, and later her body was found dead in the woods. 2 years ago in Winnipeg, a man intentionally sought out and killed 4 Indigenous women. He specifically targeted homeless Indigenous women and women who used shelters because they were more vulnerable and more likely to go back to his apartment, where he would sexually assault them, abuse them, murder them, and then leave their bodies in garbage cans and dumpsters. One of those dumpsters was taken to the Prairie Green landfill, where their bodies were unknowingly dumped, and then over the next few weeks, 10,000 tons of garbage were dumped on top of them. Their names were Morgan Harris and Mercedes Myron, and the Winnipeg government decided not to search the landfills for their remains because it was too dangerous and costly, they said. Then the Indigenous people who protested this decision and said that a landfill is not a final resting place for anyone, and something should be done about this, they said. They were called too political, too dramatic, and too controversial, just like Nakuset has been called for speaking about these things online. Could you imagine if this happened to somebody that you loved, and when you got upset about it, people scoffed at you and told you to calm down, you're blowing this out of proportion, you're being too political, you get 5% off on TVs, why are you complaining about your mother's body being in a landfill? And if you think I'm being overdramatic, we can look at young girls like Cambria Harris who are in this situation right now. Cambria Harris, the daughter of Morgan Harris, whose body was in a landfill, has become an advocate for social justice. She has been pushing for an investigation into these decisions around the landfill and why they won't look for her mother's remains. In doing research for this episode, I saw the comments that people were making about her, and they were so disgusting that I don't even want to repeat them. And these were comments made towards a young girl who was advocating for her mother's body to be taken out of a landfill. And this is why I want to talk about this on my platform, because a lot of people think Canada, it's better than the US. They're so nice up there. That is not the truth. That is not the truth for everyone that lives in Canada. I can tell you, though, as of June 2024, the government agreed to do the search of the landfills. It took 2 years for them to reverse this decision, and it's only because of passionate protesters like Cambria that this happened at all. And this isn't Cambria's first battle with political action. In 2014, there was a 15-year-old Indigenous girl named Tina Fontaine who was murdered and found in a river. Because of this, Cambria marched in a protest with a sign that read, "I will not be next." She was 13 years old at the time and said, "Year after year, we see hundreds of us scattered across billboards in the city and nobody blinks an eye. And then when we're found, society just kind of watches. And then they cry and they grieve and then they forget about us until the next story comes along. And we're not a story. We're people," she said. You see these women going missing left and right, so why can't you see that this is an ongoing crisis when it's right in front of you? She said that when she was 13. She had no idea that 8 years later, the same exact crisis would take her own mother's life. Later, we're going to hear from some Degrassi fans and hear what they have to say. But for now, I want to tell you about one more issue: environmental terrorism. I spoke before about how the government intentionally limited farming resources to Indigenous people in the past. Well, that same thing was done with water. Canada has the largest freshwater reserves in the entire world, and yet because of these treaties that were put in place, Indigenous people did not have control or access to their own water supply, and over 600 Indigenous communities did not have access to safe drinking water. And this is something that's still happening today. Today, there's communities that are placed under water advisory warnings, which means that it's unsafe to drink water or bathe in it unless you boil it first. One community in Gull Bay First Nation was put under a water boiling advisory in 1988. And only now, 36 years later, have they been given funding by the government to do something about it. And that's only because they sued the government. They spent literally decades asking the government to do something about their access to clean water, and the government said no. So after almost 4 decades, they finally took them to court and won. And an even bigger win is that originally only 2 tribes in Ontario took them to court, but they were able to win this battle and get a settlement for all of Canada. Which is amazing, but why did this happen at all? Why did it take all of this effort to get access to clean drinking water? Chris Muanis, who is the Neskantaga chief, gave some insight on this and how this win really feels for his community. He says that it's a great move forward, but it's not as simple as just throwing money at a problem. He says because of this water ban that has lasted decades, there's deep scars that are felt within their community. He said he doesn't trust tap water, even if it's supposedly clean. Because of this lack of trust that's built up over decades, even when he goes to visit other people's homes who aren't under a water advisory, he won't drink their water from a tap. He's gone decades believing that water is unsafe and you have to buy it from a store. Chris said that he has friends' houses who are filled with water bottles, that it's hard to move around because that's the only way that they know how to live, he said. It will take time and work for our community members to rebuild trust in the government and in the water, even if a new facility is built, he said. So imagine, you live a life where the women in your family are more likely to experience domestic violence or be killed. You're hearing the government say your life isn't worth searching a landfill for, the same government that stripped you of your family history and identity. You can't go to your own tap and drink water from your own kitchen, and because you get something like a 5% tax break, white people think you're a lazy piece of shit who's a drain on our economy. And if you say anything about it, you're too political, you're too dramatic, and you're too much of a waste of space for them to put up with it. You should be grateful that we let you live at all, is the message that Canadians consistently send to Indigenous people. I feel passionate about it because I allowed my education system to teach me that none of this is happening, that Indigenous people are a thing of the past, that they were savages and primitive and human beings that we saved and we changed for the better. And the people who are left are lazy, loud complainers who just want more free stuff handed to them on my dime and my taxes. I don't think that Degrassi had to be the show that taught this history to us specifically. I understand that many people who worked on the show were just like me and had no idea the truth of what was really happening. White people get the privilege of living in this bubble where we don't understand what it's like to be a statistic. 56% of people who look just like us are more likely to be abused, beaten, and murdered. People who look just like us are more likely to be left in a landfill and told that there's nothing anybody can do about it and we need to calm down. We don't understand what that feels like. We don't understand what going 36 years without clean water does to your psychology as a human being. How do you trust anyone after that? And again, Degrassi isn't responsible for this. They aren't responsible to tell the story or make these issues a focal point of the show. But you see now why I am so passionate about the fact that Degrassi doesn't have one single character that identifies themselves as an Indigenous. Why having a character with an Indigenous last name and the audience needing to fill it in through clues that, oh, maybe this character might be Indigenous. That isn't the best that they could do. Degrassi is a show that prides itself on being inclusive, on telling stories that kids all over the world can relate to. Their show ran in over 150 countries across the world. It was successful because kids everywhere could tune in and see their stories told on television. They even shifted their focus to appeal to American audiences by reshooting scenes with American money, using U.S. locations like Degrassi Goes Hollywood, Degrassi Takes Manhattan, Degrassi Las Vegas. The students dream of going to Yale, MIT, and Stanford. Characters like Fiona and Declan moved to Degrassi from New York. The Baker family comes up from Florida. We did a whole season about their extreme Christian values from the South. But Indigenous kids who live in Canada couldn't even see themselves on Degrassi. I'm not asking for a storyline that covers all of this. I'm asking for one student to say the phrase, "I am Indigenous," so Indigenous kids can have something to relate to. While doing research for this episode, I looked online to see if there were any discussions that were already happening, or any reasons that were listed as to why Degrassi didn't include Indigenous characters on their show. And I didn't necessarily find any comments from writers or producers, but I did find some Degrassi fans who had their own opinions to share. What do Degrassi fans think about the lack of Indigenous representation on Degrassi? I looked online to see what conversations were happening in the Degrassi fan community already. And a Reddit user named SeniorInevitable77 said, "Has anybody else noticed that there's a severe lack of Indigenous representation on the show? I get that it was made in a different time, but considering that they tried to include all walks of life, this kind of saddens me. I can't even remember there being a single Indigenous student in the show, or at least nobody that was in the main cast. I barely even heard them talk about Indigenous people or issues at all. Considering that this takes place in Toronto, it makes it a little hard to believe that there wouldn't be a single Indigenous student at their school." And this sparked a big discussion in the comments. One commenter said, "I feel like a lot of Canadian issues got swept aside to appeal to American audiences. Anti-Indigenous racism is a huge problem in this country, and it never got addressed once." And as you already know, I totally agree. I think especially near the end of the show, when Indigenous issues were becoming more prevalent in the media and something we were actually talking about and learning about, that's the time that Degrassi was becoming a more Americanized version of itself and drifting farther away from Canadian storytelling. I applaud them for focusing on stories like Becky Baker, a girl from the southern US who brings a lot of prejudiced views to Degrassi. Views that were coming from real protesters at the time who had Becky's same values and wanted Degrassi to be canceled simply for having a trans character on the show. By bringing Becky and her Christian family into the picture, they were able to face those criticisms head on. But the same care isn't put into issues that are happening right here in our own country. Another commenter joined in on the discussion and said most Indigenous people live thousands of miles north of Toronto in our territories like the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, which are largely filled with Indigenous population. And if they do live in places like Ontario or British Columbia, it's on a reservation, which is where most of these issues take place. So I'm not sure how that would have intertwined with the school and the cast, they said. Another user echoed this thought and broke down the statistics to show that in Toronto, Indigenous people made up less than 1% of the population. So it makes sense that statistically, Indigenous people wouldn't be cast for the show, which are both comments that are rooted in ignorance, racism, and again, a lack of awareness. Yes, statistically, there are places where Indigenous people are more likely to live. But Indigenous people live everywhere. And in a place like Toronto, 0.8%, where there's literally millions of people living there, that number is still huge. And Degrassi's not sitting down with a calculator trying to figure out these percentages and getting the casting right based on these statistics. When we try to rationalize why people are excluded, we just become part of the problem that's excluding them ourselves. However, you can argue that because media is inherently racist and favors white people or people who have wealth in their family, that it is statistically more likely that a white person will be hired over an Indigenous person. And maybe that's what this commenter meant. Jennifer Podemski, or Miss Suave, had this same thing happen to her. She was going into auditions for Indigenous characters, and white people were being hired instead. But then people were saying, oh, it's because there's no Indigenous actors in Toronto. And that's just not true. And I don't know if we've picked up the vibe here, but the Canadian government and Canadian people aren't too keen on helping Indigenous people succeed. So you can argue that Indigenous people are less likely to be hired as actors, but not that they're less likely to want to be actors or they're less likely to live in spaces where actors work. They're just people. They don't behave any differently than we do. And we know already that Degrassi has hired Indigenous actors. They did give Grace and her mom an Indigenous last name, but she's still an Indigenous actor. These kind of comments are why representation is so important. People are arguing online saying that it's statistically unlikely to have an Indigenous actor try out for the show. That same thinking is what results in straight people playing queer characters and cis people playing trans characters. Statistically, Toronto's population is only 0.2% trans, even less of a percentage than Indigenous. But we wouldn't accept Degrassi today hiring a cis person and saying, oh, we couldn't find any trans kids. They're statistically not likely to live here. We need to put that same critical thinking into hiring Indigenous actors. They're here, they're people. Otherwise, you're just squandering their opportunities and telling them that it's because they don't exist. Another user replied back to all of these comments and simply said, I'm literally Indigenous and I live in Toronto. We don't just live in one place. And I loved that. Another user named MapPrestigious5912 said that Degrassi missed a big opportunity to help inform people about Canada's terrible history with Indigenous people. And you know that I agree. All I'm asking for is one character to say that they're Indigenous. But in a dream world, we'd have storylines about Indigenous students living in Toronto. But we also need to remember it's not just about teaching our history. It's also a very active present that we live in. It's happening right now. And it isn't always about murder, landfills, or statistical violence. It can be as small as a name. On the east coast of Nova Scotia, we have a mall called the Micmac Mall, and it's named after the Mi'kmaq people in Atlantic Canada, which is where Nakuset's family is from. But this is the classic tale of white people finding simple things too hard to pronounce, so instead they oversimplified it and called it the Micmac Mall. Then, when Indigenous people asked for it to be changed to the appropriate name, the Mi'kmaq Mall, they were told to stop being so sensitive and stop complaining all the time, just for asking it to be called the right thing. I mean, it's as simple as learning someone's name. It's just a sign of decency and respect to get it right. If your name was John and someone kept calling you Joan, you probably wouldn't love that. And imagine if you corrected them and they scoffed at you and said, get over it. Recently, the Micmac Mall went through a $55 million renovation, and protesters asked if they would consider changing the name during this time. And they said, absolutely not. And many people in Nova Scotia were behind them. One commenter said, complaining about things that were offensive in the past is not the way. We don't need to change long-standing business names. What about the Micmac Boat Club, the Micmac Grill? Do they all have to change too? It's like, I can see why people who are Mi'kmaq are passionate about the name change, but like, why are these white people coming to such hard defense for these boat clubs? 2 years ago, Halifax changed the name of one of their streets because it celebrated a man from Canadian history who was openly racist towards Indigenous people. His name was Edward Cornwallis, and he issued a proclamation where for every Indigenous person you killed, you'd get a bounty of 10 fowl, which are like birds. For every Indigenous person you killed, you would get 10 birds. That's horrific. So because of this history, they decided to rename that street, and they renamed it to Nora Bernard Street. And Nora Bernard was a woman who was a survivor of the residential schools, which again only closed 30 years ago. So someone compared this moment where the street name was changed, and compared it to the mall name and said, I knew that when we let them rename Cornwallis Street, that this wouldn't end. They want every building torn down and rebuilt with a new name all about them. Again, it is crazy to me that white people are bringing such a passionate energy to streets named after racist people, to names that could just be pronounced a little differently to be more sensitive, when the other side is saying that we want this changed because this person thought my life was worth 10 birds. I genuinely don't understand what is wrong with us. I don't get it. Jennifer Podemski, or Miss Suave, spoke about the fact that there's a general lack of media with Indigenous people in it, and that can be a problem because it can lead to people filling in the gaps with their own racist beliefs. I recently read a book by Matt Baum called Hi Honey, I'm Homo, and it's all about queer representation on television. He talked about how queer people simply being on television led to the overturning of anti-LGBTQ laws in the United States. Joe Biden is literally quoted as saying the TV show Will and Grace is what convinced him to change his views on marriage equality, marriage between two men or two women. He went from voting against gay marriage to voting for gay marriage because of Will and Grace. He said, "I think Will and Grace probably did more to educate the American public than almost anything anybody has done so far." Deborah Messing, the Grace of the show, said, "We knew when we were doing Will and Grace that we were doing something important that was having a social effect and a political effect. This is a result of putting gay people on TV. The general public had a view that gay people were disgusting, full of diseases, and sexual predators. And now people were changing their political views because they saw gay people be humanized and normalized on television. We're just people too." That's the impact of having gay people on TV. The same exact thing happens with Indigenous representation, and that's why I'm so passionate about it. I personally saw the effects of what it was like to see myself on TV, for other people to see me on TV. If I watched television 30 or 40 years ago, I'd have never seen myself on screen, especially not as a main character. And now I'm a proud advocate for Degrassi because of the way that made me feel. It made me feel so seen, so heard, and so understood. Like I could be myself and nobody could tell me any different. And Indigenous kids in Canada never got that. Except for one time, when Degrassi included Indigenous representation on a show called Degrassi Talks. Whoa, wait. Degrassi did have Indigenous representation on the show? Or not? I'm confused. Well, let's go back a second. Canonically, on the show Degrassi, there have been no Indigenous characters, or at least none that have identified themselves as Indigenous. It's up to you to make your own decision about Grace Cardinal and her mom, and what that representation means to you. I am not here to discredit Grace's or Nakuset's Indigenous representation on television. But back in 1992, Indigenous people did appear on a Degrassi TV show. After the classic era of Degrassi Junior High and Degrassi High Wrapped, Degrassi put the cameras and microphones into the hands of their actors in a series called Degrassi Talks. Degrassi Talks was all about exploring the issues they covered on the show, but in a documentary style, with real high school students all around Canada. Amanda Steptoe, who played Spike, interviewed real teen moms about being a pregnant teenager. Stacey Mistician, who played Caitlin Ryan, interviewed kids about sexuality because of her episode with Miss Avery. And Neil Hope, who played Wheels, interviewed kids about the effect of alcohol and alcohol addiction. From coast to coast, the Degrassi kids traveled looking for real kids to talk about their real problems. And overwhelmingly, this show featured Indigenous kids.
We've all got real problems, but can't always solve them. We need someone to listen, cause we all need some talking.
Some try to ignore, but we've got to explore. We cannot hide it all away. Let's do this together.
Well, I'll talk to you,
And you'll talk to me. We've got to reach out to set us free. Degrassi Talks. Coast to coast, we hear real stories from real people. Degrassi Talks.
Degrassi listens.
You're not alone, let's do this together. Degrassi Talks.
In Canada, all the problems that happen on Degrassi happen to Indigenous kids too, but at a much faster, alarming rate. The issues most teenagers deal with when they're 15, 16, or 17, when it comes to drugs, alcohol, and sex, can begin for Indigenous kids at ages more like 8, 9, or 10. Statistically, if the government comes in and takes everything away from you, convinces the public that their acts of violence against you are what's best for you, and does things like cuts off your access to clean drinking water, then your community is more likely to have an increase of violence, assault, addiction, and drug use, no matter what the color of your skin is or where you're from. On Degrassi Talks, at least 1/3 of the people they interview for their main show are Indigenous. Let's listen into this episode of Degrassi Talks about alcohol, hosted by Neil Hope. In this first clip, he's speaking to an Indigenous woman named Rose, who's sitting with her friends from Whitehorse in the Yukon, a Northern Territory in Canada.
It's been really well known among a lot of people in the Yukon and outside of the Yukon all over Canada. The Whitehorse Yukon, or the Yukon, and the territories in general have a really high drinking rate. Per capita. There's just a lot of bars. We don't ever close our bars on a Sunday. They're always open. There's always a lot of access. You can get a drink whenever you want. I started drinking when I was really young. I think I had my first drink when I was about 10 years old. And it just seemed like it was waiting there for me at that age. Like it was sitting there at that part of my path, I guess you could say, and it was waiting for me to pick it up, and I did. I had nothing but terrible experiences with it. It was all like a big, try to fit in. I'm not different anymore. I'm a part of something. Like, I'm not floating anywhere anymore. And I really, really abused alcohol, and I really got, the biggest thing for me is that people automatically start judging you and giving you labels. And I got this label of being a orangutan and a drunk and a troublemaker and everything else, and it was somebody. I had a label. I was somebody. I wasn't just nobody anymore.
Is there any pressure to drink, do you think, for teenagers?
Spirited Native Youth Council, to me, is to try to get youth to be substance-free and try to be more or less a support group among young people for us to do activities that don't pertain to any alcohol or drugs.
Gives them an opportunity also to learn more about their roots and their culture. And by doing that, that helps with self-esteem and self-worth. I'd like to ask you to be with us, and I pray for our brothers and sisters around the Yukon and around the world who are suffering from alcohol and drugs. And I pray that you'll be with us and give us the strength to take care of ourselves in order to help others. Thank you for this day.
This clip, which was recorded back in 1992, expressed all the worries and fears that we're covering so far in this episode in 2024. There are 30 years between the conversation Degrassi had with Rose and her friends and the conversation we're having here right now. And still, Degrassi never had an Indigenous character on their show. In that same episode, they also spoke to Nathan from the Rama Reserve. Here's part of his story.
I went to visit Nathan on the Rama Reserve, and I found out that he and I have a lot in common.
That's great.
My mom was an alcoholic, and I lost my dad about 4 years ago. He had cirrhosis of the liver, alcoholic's disease.
My mom and dad have separated. I blame my drinking on my parents. I try to get out of the house and everything. I get away from the drinking. I end up going into town and getting drunk myself with my friends.
How many days a week did you drink, and how much a day were you drinking?
4 days, roughly.
4 days?
4 days, yeah.
And getting drunk every day?
Yeah. Wake up, have a beer, right through the day, till I pass out.
What are the side effects of drinking?
Yeah, my sister was drunk one night. She was walking home. She fell into a van. She fell underneath it. She was dragged underneath it for 72 feet. And she was taken to the hospital. I guess she realized what happened, but she didn't really feel the pain. You can hear her screaming in there. It's like, my mom was crying, and I was just sitting there really quiet. Everybody else is not forcing it on you. It's you yourself. You make your own decisions for your own life, not anybody else. It's your own decision the way you want to run your life.
To give you even more context, in between all of these main interviews, they interview kids around the area who are just kind of walking around. This is something called a streeter interview, where they just ask you 1 or 2 questions and then they play it throughout the show. And so many of these kids that they interview and are telling their stories are Indigenous. In that same episode about alcohol, they also tell a story about Jimmy Whiffen, an Indigenous child involved in a drinking and driving accident. He was 15 years old and he went out drinking with 2 adults. Within half an hour, his blood alcohol level was 6 times over the legal limit and he went out driving. But his body wasn't found in a car. It was found in a dumpster. In this episode of Degrassi Talks, they cover 3 different stories of Indigenous kids being affected by alcohol addiction. Rose and her friends, Nathan and Jeremy Whiffen. But still, no Indigenous students ever make it onto the show. In the next episode about depression, hosted by Pat Mastriani or Joey Jeremiah, they talk to Dean from the Cold Lake Native Reserve. Dean talks about his depression around environmentalism and the lack of protection in his community. Here's what he had to say.
This is a hard world to grow up in. This is, I think, maybe in the history of mankind, this might be the hardest time that kids have had to grow up in. When I moved here in 1977, this was the most beautiful place that I'd ever seen.
We went to Alberta to talk to Dean.
Was really clear.
He lives on the Cold Lake First Nation Reserve.
And now there's hardly, it's not very often that I see a deer. Or bears, there used to be a lot of bears here, and now there aren't as many.
Why do you think this has happened?
Well, what happened was, about the time I moved back, they started building heavy oil sands projects around this lake and around this area. And with that came an influx of people, as well as industry. And since that time, when they started heavy usage of the oil and that's when I've noticed how the environment has been changing very quickly. Over here, you can still swim in this lake, but what scares me is the fact that if this pollution continues, that maybe someday we won't be able to.
Yeah.
And it really depresses me, a lot of times when I think about it. I wonder, how long does it have to continue, and is it going to get better?
Or is it going to get worse?
Yeah, or is it going to get worse, If the land is polluted and destroyed, how are we going to grow food? Like, maybe it might be just fine for my whole lifetime. But what if I'm contributing to this destruction of the earth? What about my children? I moved to Edmonton, and I felt very lost because I didn't have any close friends there. And also I started going to university. And the whole university environment to me was foreign. I didn't really understand it. That I had a lot of feelings were starting to surface from within me. A lot of anger, a lot of sadness, a lot of pain. And I didn't know where it was coming from. I didn't know why I was feeling the way I was feeling.
How did you feel when you were really depressed?
It was a feeling of being in pain all the time. An agony. It was just hurting. I was really hurting inside. And I felt alone and helpless, powerless. And I just felt no hope. I just wanted to die. I started to learn about spirituality. And I started to learn that I had to do some things in order to get some help. That I had to ask for it. And not only that, but I had to work at it. And then go about and trying to change what I could change. Try to change the way that I was living. And try to change the way that I was thinking. Try to change the way that I was feeling. And I found that once that was established, then that's when I began to grow.
I looked up that river that Dean was speaking about, and just last month, an unsafe water advisory was put in for the Kenoso Beach in Cold Lake, near his reserve. It was because of an increase in bacteria that made the water unsafe to drink or swim in, and people in the community were advised not to go near it. So 30 years later, he was right. His worst fears came true. In another episode about drugs, Celiac Sasanasi, who played Rick, narrates an interview with Brian, a youth chief in Winnipeg. Here's what he had to say.
The doctor told me the next day, or a couple of days later, another hour or so, I would have been dead because of sniffing.
Brian is a youth chief of his band in Norway House, north of Winnipeg. Until a few years ago, Brian was a serious solvent abuser.
Why? Yes, solvent abuse has been an issue for Native communities for many years. And in some areas it's getting better, some areas it's getting worse. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of Native communities, people in Native communities use solvent is because that's what's readily available. That's what gets you away from the hardship, the pain that you might be experiencing in your life. For me, that's what it was. It was something that I could do that I didn't really have to use my mind. I didn't have to feel any pain.
At what age did you start abusing solvents?
Well, I guess I started I did start at a very early age. I started, I think I was about 7 or 8 years old around there. And it's hard for me to recall back, because of the effects solvents have had on me. A lot of memories are not there. But I started very early. I reached a point in my life and point in time in my life where I said, I have no future. I have no past. I have nothing. And there's this girl that, that really does care about me, and I felt it. And of course, I returned that love for her. And I reached a point in my life, I guess, where, I was just existing. We have to stop blaming others. We have to take responsibility for our actions. In the Indian culture, in our culture, we try to implement 4 principles in our lives. And that is to respect, to be honest, to love, and to share. If we have these principles in our lives, we will stop poisoning ourselves.
And this is only a fraction of the stories that are told by Indigenous people on Degrassi Talks. Degrassi went out and did the research and spoke to Indigenous kids, taking their stories and using them as an example of why their own show matters so much, why it's so important to tell these stories, and then never put them on TV, never put them on their main show. And again, I'm not asking for them to do a special episode about Indigenous issues. Indigenous issues are human issues. They're people who are dealing with drugs, alcohol, abuse, sexuality, parents' divorce, age, HIV. They're dealing with all of these things just like every other kid in Canada, but we won't put them on TV unless it's a documentary. Grace's storylines could have stayed the same, but if they just put a little more effort into making her an Indigenous character, that could have been huge for representation. Maybe it's one conversation with her mom about Indigenous history like Shay had with her dad about racism. Maybe it's subtlety in clothes that she wears or the things on the walls in her bedroom. Maybe it's mentioned during all these times that the kids protest in Degrassi Next Class about how she can relate because she's Indigenous. And this is something that has happened to her. It's so simple to be inclusive, and it feels like Degrassi tried harder to be uninclusive. Almost like there was an active effort not to tell these stories at all. Whether it was conscious or unconscious or biased or unbiased, it still happened. There was never an Indigenous character who identified themselves as Indigenous on Degrassi. But like I said, this is something that's not up for me to decide if this is representation that's good enough. Now that we've covered the history of Indigenous representation on Degrassi and the history of Indigenous genocide in Canada and the modern day realities that Indigenous people face every day, I think it's time that we talk to some real Indigenous Degrassi fans and hear what they have to say about the history and impact of Indigenous representation, or the lack thereof, on Degrassi. Thank you so much to our subscribers on Patreon who made this episode possible. A huge shout out goes to supporters like Degrassi CSI, Jolene, Kennedy, Amber, Angelica, Christopher, Dave, Nicholas, Sarah J, and Shannon who supported at our highest tier possible. A huge thank you goes to our amazing editor Evie Bassini for putting all of this together. And to supporters like Alyssa, Alana, Angie, Becca, Brittany, Katrina, Chantel, Chrissy, Christine, Darcy, Emily, Gina, Eugene, Honey, Jamie, Jessica, Joe, Joey, Catherine, Casey, Kristen, Crystal, Kylia, Lindsay, Lizzie, Lizzie Games, Mackenzie, Mike, Megan, Mina, Nikki, Nixon from Degrassi Generations Facebook group. I recommend you join. Rachel, Racine, Randy, Rebecca, Renee, Sawyer, Sarah, Sam, Shane, Stephanie, Sierra, Sanita, Taylor, and Tierney. You guys are all amazing and have made this episode possible. Thank you so much. I love you. Bye.